Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Fantasy Football Prodigy channel. My name is Tyler Anderson. I will be your host today, and this is episode number 2. I hope you guys enjoyed episode number 1. I learned a lot from posting that episode and trying to get things figured out. So hopefully we have some improvements to make here, but I'm excited to get into this episode because this is going to be an exciting one. We are going to be doing a recap of the 2024 NFL Draft. Particularly, it is going to be the NFC teams in this episode. And then next episode, we will be covering the AFC teams. So make sure to subscribe or follow wherever you are listening. This intro song, just a shout out to my friend Spencer, is by Misty Air by Aquatic Pets. He's a friend of mine that makes music. Link in description. I'll put it in the YouTube description. I'm not sure if I can put it on Spotify or how that all works. But if you're on Spotify, you can just literally look up Aquatic Pets and find his music, or wherever you're listening. Just find the guy. Shout out Spencer for letting me use that for my intro song. And yeah, before we get into the NFL draft, we are just going to cover some recent NFL news. Zay Jones released by the Jacksonville Jaguars. I was very surprised to see this news. I was kind of doing some research on what was going on around the league right before I started recording, and I saw, oh, Zay Jones got cut. I thought that was a little strange. Just because a couple seasons ago, he did have a pretty good year, and it looked like he had some sort of rapport going on with Trevor Lawrence. But last year he kind of dealt with injuries and wasn't, very available. But yeah, he's off the team now. The Jaguars also did lose Calvin Ridley in free agency, but they did add Gabe Davis in free agency from the Bills, and they also drafted Brian Thomas Jr. in the first round, which we will talk about in the next episode. So make sure to subscribe so you can hear more about that. But yeah, right now it looks like Trevor Lawrence core receivers are going to be Christian Kirk, Brian Thomas, and Gabe Davis as the big play deep threat. Parker Washington is also a little bit of a sleeper that flashed at times. And then Evan Ingram is going to hold it down at that tight end position. Moving on with the news, the Raiders signed former Dallas Cowboys wide receiver Michael Gallup. I remember Gallup got a big extension a few years back and just totally disappointed, did not do anything for fantasy or for the Cowboys. And he got cut, and now he is on the Raiders. So they already have Devontae Adams and Jacoby Myers there. Trey Tucker is another kind of sleeper guy there that might make noise as a deep threat, but who knows? Maybe Michael Gallup can outperform Tucker and see the field, but we'll see. The Chiefs did extend superstar future Hall of Fame tight end Travis Kelce on a 2-year, $34.25 million deal. He had a slower second half of the season. It kind of seemed like the team was maybe saving him for the playoffs, not using him as much as they could have, and it worked because they did win a Super Bowl, but he's now under contract until 2025. And until he retires, he will be fantasy relevant. So it's good to know that he signed that extension. I mean, maybe that means he aims to play a couple more seasons. I mean, we'll see what he ends up doing, but if you have him in Dynasty, you might be able to get a little more juice out of that. After a little bit more juice out of that guy. I don't think I want to say it like that. Pause. But yeah, moving on. The Cowboys did sign former Cowboys running back Ezekiel Elliott. He had a 1-year stint with the New England Patriots. Didn't look very good. He had some fantasy relevant games just based on volume and touchdowns, but we'll talk about this a little bit more later when we talk about the draft, but the Cowboys did not draft a running back. So right now it's Zeke and Rico Dowdle as the lead backs for the Dallas Cowboys. And that makes sense because I had Rico Dowdle on my fantasy team on my dynasty team at one point, and I did drop him last year. Not thinking, he could become like maybe the starter of the Dallas Cowboys. So that's kind of how it goes in dynasty with me. Whenever I drop a player, they usually become a league winning running back. The most notable player would be Raheem Mostert, who I did drop when he was like a 4th string running back, like over 5 years ago. And at age he's in his early 30s, coming off a 20 plus touchdown season. So you're welcome, all the Mostert managers that won championships with him last year. That only happened because I did drop him for nothing in Dynasty. You're welcome. Moving on, Tank Dell. Unfortunately, this is not good. He sustained a minor wound from a shooting on Saturday. And I am recording this on Saturday the 30th. Just for a reference, it is Tuesday, April 30th. So this was on Saturday, not too long ago. He appears to be fine. He's been released from the hospital. But scary situation, could have been worse. Glad it wasn't. But yeah, there was a gunshot wound, I guess. So that's not, you don't like that. But it sounds like he wasn't really involved as a shooter of, he wasn't shooting, I don't think. I mean, maybe more will come out, but it just seems like he was a victim of a gunshot wound. So glad he's okay. Not super fantasy relevant, but cornerback Chris Harris Jr. retiring after 12 NFL seasons. Just wanted to shout him out because he was kind of one of those core defensive players that was making Pro Bowls. I believe he won a Super Bowl with Denver over the Carolina Panthers in Super Bowl 50. So I just want to shout him out because he's one of those players that was kind of like a core defensive player when I started watching football up until now, and now he's sort of he's gone. So, the players that were playing when I first started watching football are all gone. Chris Harris came along sort of, a little bit after that, obviously, but yeah. So players are coming and going. Speaking of coming and going, wide receiver Jarvis Landry. I should have tied this in with the Jacksonville news about Zay Jones, but he's expected to participate in Jags rookie camp. I don't know if this is really anything, but he's 31 when I checked. Didn't play last year. Was once a good PPR option. I doubt he makes the team, but if he does, he probably won't see much playing time. But that, just put that on your radar. That is a thing. And then finally, we're just gonna finish this off with the AJ Brown news. He just signed a big extension, 3-year, $96 million contract. I believe he's the highest paid wide receiver now in terms of annual value. But guys like CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, they'll probably one up that, sort of like AJ Brown did with Amon-Ra St. Brown's deal. And Amon-Ra also did get a contract extension recently as well. For what that's worth, I haven't covered that on this show. It has been a while, but I will still cover it. I believe that was a 4-year, $120 million extension is what I'm seeing for Amon-Ra St. Brown. So you like that for Amon-Ra to be tied to that offense for the foreseeable future. And along with AJ Brown, Devontae Smith, fellow Philadelphia Eagles wide receiver, signed a contract extension before AJ Brown. It was a 3-year, $75 million contract. So those guys are making money. So it looks like the core of that offense is going to be Jalen Hurts, AJ Brown, Devontae Smith, and then, of course, newly signed Saquon Barkley out of the backfield. So that's all the news that I have. I don't think I missed anything too crazy. This is kind of the first episode where I ever covered news, so I didn't really know how far back to go and what was super fantasy relevant and not. But as we start uploading, I'll just cover the news between episodes, and that'll make a little bit more sense. So we're going to get into the NFL draft recap. Before we do, again, just make sure to subscribe wherever you're listening so you can stay tuned for the AFC episode when that comes out next. This is only half of the teams in the league, obviously. So if you listen to this episode, you're going to want to listen to the next episode as well. That is very important so that you can get a lay of the land with these rookies, what it means for these NFL teams that drafted them, how draft capital is going to affect certain things. Just different scenarios, different situations, different possible outcomes that I'm going to try to touch on here in this episode. So we're going to start in the NFC North. I am a Minnesota Vikings fan. And I was very, very happy with our draft. I say our draft because I am part of the team. I'm not going to talk about every single draft pick that happened. I'm only going to really talk about the skill position players, maybe a lineman or two here and there. But the Minnesota Vikings took a very fantasy relevant player with the 10th overall pick. They had the 11th pick. They traded up one spot. It was a crazy quarterback run that we saw in the draft. So I think they just traded up one spot to kind of block some other teams, like maybe the Raiders or Broncos, from trading up. But the Vikings selected quarterback J.J. McCarthy out of Michigan. They did have Sam Darnold on the roster, as well as Nick Mullins. They signed Sam Darnold in the offseason. And Darnold is not the future of this offense, not the future of anything, sadly. He is a somewhat capable player, not necessarily a good starter, but could start. And if he had started for the Vikings, I think, best case scenario, they might have been an average fringe playoff team, maybe snuck in a wild card. But we know he's not the quarterback of the future. But now the Vikings have a chance at a guy that could be the future. And they didn't have to spend a lot to get him. I know it sounds crazy for the 10th overall pick to say that, but to get your shot at your future franchise quarterback with the 10th pick, that's not crazy draft capital just for the quarterback position. JJ McCarthy wasn't really viewed as this high of a prospect early on in the process, but as the draft got closer, his stock rose. I think that happens a lot with quarterbacks. So the jury's still out on if he will be the guy, but it's so hard to evaluate quarterbacks. People just never... There doesn't seem to be anyone in the world that really knows who is going to pan out in the NFL. And I'm not going to sit here and say, I know who's going to be good and who's not in this NFL draft. I'm just here to kind of talk about the situation and what could happen if they do pan out. And his situation is as good as pretty much any rookie. We'll talk about Caleb Williams later, but he has a very good situation in Minnesota. With Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson when he comes back from injury at tight end. And, if he pans out, he'll be relevant for fantasy just with the weapons he has. Even this year, once he finds his footing, could be someone you find yourself streaming later in the year. I'm not drafting him as like a starter to start the season for fantasy. And I'm not sure. I mean, I would expect he would start the year, but they do have Sam Darnold, and maybe they let JJ sit a little bit. I guess it kind of depends how training camp goes. But for the Vikings, if McCarthy is not the guy, they can rebuild, they can reset, and take a quarterback in a different draft. And what I like about this pick is they didn't blow up their team. They didn't trade multiple future picks to get this guy. They took him 10th overall, and even if he doesn't pan out, they haven't mortgaged their future to get him on the team. So a lot of times these teams, they trade the farm for a failed quarterback prospect, and then they're just stuck for years. So that is not the case here. But it's hard to tell which quarterbacks are going to, translate to the NFL. But in this offense and what he accomplished in college, coming up a national championship, he will have a chance to make noise for fantasy down the road. Another nice selection for the Minnesota Vikings, Dallas Turner, edge rusher out of Alabama. One of the biggest steals of the draft. He fell a little bit in the draft just because so many offensive players were taken. The Vikings traded up, and they did, give up some draft capital to get him, but I think that's a good move for the team. I'm not going to talk about any more defensive players. I just want to shout him out because Skull Vikings, and I love that move. That was a good steal. And then really the only other notable fantasy option that they took was a kicker. Also an Alabama player, I believe, right? Yep. Will Richard? Did I say his name? Richard? The Vikings have been looking for a kicker for a while. And he was a really good college kicker, so I don't hate taking a shot on him in the 6th round. I'm cool with it. The Vikings have been a little bit snake bitten with kickers. Even when they have a good kicker, they miss a playoff kick, or they have a bad kicker, they cut him, and he turns into one of the best kickers in the league. Daniel Carlson. Anyways, we are going to move on to the Chicago Bears, staying within the NFC North. Big shocker here with the 1st overall pick. The Chicago Bears went with quarterback Caleb Williams out of USC, the pick that everyone expected. I think I saw someone bet like $20,000 or something insane to win $100 on this pick. Don't quote me on that, but it was like, a ton of money to win barely any because it was such a given that he was going to be taken. So congrats to that guy on winning his bet. But Chicago gets their quarterback after trading away Justin Fields to the Pittsburgh Steelers. For a couple seasons, Caleb Williams has been kind of anointed as the next big prospect. He didn't perform statistically as well last season as the season prior, but he is still an amazing quarterback prospect and one of the best in recent history. From what I heard, he wasn't quite an Andrew Luck level prospect, but he was kind of like a Trevor Lawrence level prospect, which, I mean, T-Law hasn't really had a big fantasy season yet, and maybe he will, but long story short, Caleb Williams, he's going to matter for fantasy. He has some mobility and can extend plays. Just a dynamic playmaker, can, throw the ball really well. All the good things you can say about a quarterback. And he is in arguably the greatest situation a rookie quarterback selected that high, the number 1 overall pick, has ever been in. Usually a team drafting 1 overall is terrible. This team, the Chicago Bears, they're going to be competitive. They kind of turned things on down the stretch last season in 2023, and they can thank the Carolina Panthers for making that Bryce Young trade with them and getting all this draft capital where they could take Caleb Williams and have another early first-round pick, which we'll talk about next. But Caleb Williams will be throwing to DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, who they signed in free agency, and Odunze, who they did draft in the first round. We'll talk about him in a sec, as well as Cole Kmet in the tight end room. They also have Dante Pettis on the roster. Remember him when he was a sleeper? Good times. So it's a crowded wide receiver room. It might get messy in terms of who is going to have their targets on a given week if you have any of these wide receiver options. But for the team and for Caleb Williams, it's awesome to have that many options. Caleb Williams will be able to throw to the open guy, and he's got a lot of talent to work with there. So if Caleb Williams can just play well and get the ball to his playmakers, each of those receivers should have their games. It's hard to hit on quarterbacks in the draft, and rookies often don't supply multiple options with fantasy value. Not everyone is Justin Herbert or CJ Stroud. That is sort of an outlier. But rookie quarterback production, has gotten a little more modernized in the NFL as things have changed. Rookie quarterbacks are able to supply a bit more production than they were, say, 10, 20 years ago as it becomes a more passing league. So we'll just see how he plays. He's got a chance here to be a really special player. In my opinion, just how I see things playing out, Keenan Allen should be the more consistent PPR guy. I think each week he's going to see a pretty stable floor of targets, while DJ Moore might be a little bit more boom or bust, kind of like we saw in 2023. Whereas, in 2023, the inconsistency can probably be, credited to Justin Fields maybe not being the most consistent passer himself. Whereas in 2024, he might have a better passer if Caleb Williams pans out to be what we think he is, but there's more competition for targets. He's not competing with just Darnell Mooney and Cole Kmet. Now they have Keenan Allen and Odunze that they brought in, and Keenan Allen projects to be the target guy. But I have DJ Moore in Dynasty, and I'm in win now mode, but I still would like to hold on to him because long term, Keenan Allen, I believe his contract is up after this year or shortly after, but long term, this combination could be really special with Odunze and DJ Moore. And I'm just looking up Keenan Allen's contract here just to make sure. So he is signed just for 2024. Then he's a unrestricted free agent in 2025. That is Keenan Allen. So after this year, if Keenan's gone, it's going to be DJ Moore and Odunze. So Cole Kmet at tight end will continue to make big plays. He's a good player, but he's just not going to be as heavily targeted as the number 3, number 4 option in this offense. But tight end is weak, so there are going to be times where he probably has a game, gets in the end zone where you could stream him. And like I said, this is arguably the best situation for a number 1 overall quarterback pick in NFL history. So he's got a chance to do something special. Congrats, Bears fans. You're set up for success. And as a Vikings fan, I wish that wasn't the case. But anyways, another notable pick the Bears made, Odunze, wide receiver out of Washington. He was pretty much consistently ranked as the 3rd best receiver in the draft behind Marvin Harrison Jr. and Malik Nabers. He had 1,640 receiving yards in 2023. A really good wide receiver prospect. He can do a lot of different things, pretty much do everything. And he is going to be hopefully the future target for Caleb Williams. It's a great pick for Williams and the Bears offense as a whole. For fantasy, this pick might kind of muddy the waters a little bit in terms of target distribution, kind of like I talked about already. We like consolidation of targets for fantasy. So like if there's a guy who's going to get the targets each week, obviously he's going to be more consistent. Or if you have 2 options that can do that, that just kind of helps make things a little bit more predictable. to start the season. Rookies sometimes heat up as the season goes on, so it might be more consolidated to Keenan Allen and DJ Moore early on, but by the end of the year, Odunze projects to be a good player, and he might force his way into getting involved. And we'll see how much this team throws the ball. They did bring in DeAndre Swift at RB, so we'll see what the split is in terms of passing versus rushing rate. But target consistency could be a headache for people who roster these skill position players. We just like consolidation of targets so that we can better predict what's going to happen. But we'll see what happens. But Williams now has 3 legit wide receivers and a good tight end room with Cole Kmet, and they even brought in Gerald Everett in free agency for what it's worth. Yeah, I mean that's kind of the situation with the offense. It's looking good. It just might be hard to predict. Might be a headache. But I expect him to be the number 3 this year. Even if he does force his way into more production, I don't think he's passing DJ Moore or Keenan Allen on the depth chart. Because Keenan Allen, even though he's older, he's coming off one of his best seasons ever, and he looked really good. So even if Caleb Williams matches the hype, it's hard for a rookie quarterback, like I said, to supply production for 2 players, much less 3. So it might be a bit of a headache. But the Bears offense as a whole, though, should be scary, and they'll have plenty of scoring opportunities if things go right. So the biggest winner is just the Bears offense, Caleb Williams, and just Bears fans. Congrats. You were set up really well to make some noise sooner rather than later. We're going to move on to the Detroit Lions. Not much to talk about them in terms of fantasy. Skill position players. I mean, they drafted a running back in the 4th round. Why am I not? Oh, he's listed as a safety here on this website. Okay, so yeah, this is almost not even relevant, but they did draft Sion Vaki. He was listed as a running back, but he also played safety. So they might have kind of drafted him as more of a safety or a special teams player. But even if they did draft him to maybe play running back, and I'm looking at their depth chart on ESPN, it says he's listed as their 4th running back now. But David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs are the lead backs there, and they're good at what they do. And and Craig Reynolds probably will be their 3rd string running back. So not super fantasy relevant for Sion Vaki, who was drafted in the 4th round. And that was really the only skill position player that they drafted. They went cornerback in the first 2 rounds, offensive tackle in the 4th, Giovanni Manu. So one of the big winners here, it should be status quo for the Detroit Lions, but Jameson Williams, it looks like he might be their wide receiver too, so I think he's a winner here. He hasn't quite met his hype yet, but he might be a post-hype sleeper just because he's their number 2. Right now it's Amon-Ra as a clear number 1, and then the depth chart is Jameson Williams, Khalif Raymond, Donovan Peoples-Jones, who he had a year there. Donovan Peoples-Jones did, I believe, with the Browns. So yeah, he might be a low key sleeper with them not selecting a wide receiver in a loaded wide receiver draft. And Josh Reynolds is no longer on this team either, so he was kind of maybe someone who could compete to be the number 2, but he's no longer there. So not much to say about the Lions there. They should still be a good offense. And then the Packers, maybe even less to say about the Green Bay Packers. They're another team that didn't really take a ton of fantasy relevant players, but they did take a running back, MarShawn Lloyd, out of USC in the 3rd round. Pretty decent draft capital. And he was someone that a lot of scouts liked. He was, this running back class was kind of weird where there wasn't really a consensus order, but a lot of people had this guy ranked very high. And MarShawn Lloyd, he is a talented and intriguing running back prospect. Josh Jacobs, former Raiders running back, did get the big contract in free agency. But the way it is set up, from what I understand, the team, I believe it was a 4-year contract, but the team could get out of it, in a couple seasons without incurring a ton of, financial difficulties. Yeah, he signed a 4-year, $48 million contract, Josh Jacobs did, but they can get out of it in a couple of years, and it won't be like devastating to their financial salary cap situation. And so MarShawn Lloyd this year might not make a ton of noise, but he is someone to monitor in Dynasty. But he actually could have relevance this year if he can beat out AJ Dillon for the number 2 job, which might not be the hardest thing to do. AJ Dillon seemed like he was going to be a good player, and then I don't know, he's just kind of not looked impressive lately. So we'll see how that pans out. But any running back 2 can be fantasy relevant, especially on a good offense like the Packers project to be. And as a handcuff, if Jacobs goes down, Lloyd might be fantasy relevant. In that situation, I expect it to be kind of a committee with Dillon and Lloyd. But moving on, NFC West, we're going to start with the Arizona Cardinals. This is a pick I was very excited to talk about. Marvin Harrison Jr. selected 4th overall by the Arizona Cardinals. And it's just the perfect pick. This is an amazing landing spot. There's really no competition for targets in Arizona with Marvin Harrison Jr. now, and he has a really good quarterback situation. It's rare that a team with this high of a pick has such an established quarterback, but Marvin Harrison is getting to start his career catching passes from Kyler Murray, and that's about as good as it gets. He's a generational talent and prospect, the son of Hall of Fame wide receiver Marvin Harrison, Indianapolis Colts great, and he should make an immediate fantasy impact from the get-go. Michael Wilson and Greg Dortch are still sleepers as wide receiver options on the Cardinals, but Harrison should step in and be the clear alpha right away. So I'm very excited for this. I'm not, a lot of times people are scared to take rookies in redraft because they, sometimes they take a while to develop, and they can be a little bit more valuable down the second half of the season. But Marvin Harrison is someone who week 1 I would be starting with confidence. So good landing spot for Marvin Harrison Jr. In non-superflex leagues, he should be the 1-1 in Dynasty in every league. And to clarify, I'm not talking redraft. I am talking Dynasty. He should be in Dynasty rookie drafts. Okay, not over Jefferson or anything like that. I'm saying in Dynasty rookie drafts, he should be the first overall pick. Okay, just to be clear. Okay. The team also made another really intriguing pick in the 3rd round, the 2nd pick of the 3rd round. It looks like when they took Trey Benson out of Florida State. He ran a sub 4.40 at the combine. And he, like I said, this running back class is kind of interesting where there wasn't really like a consensus on the order, but he was one of those guys where a lot of people really liked him. And he can he's going to be relevant for fantasy, if not this year, probably next year. So James Conner, their current starting running back, is coming off of a great season, but he is getting a little bit older for running backs. And Trey Benson, who is a great running back prospect, he appears to have a chance to be the next man up. I do project James Conner to hold on to that starting role this season, while Benson gets worked in as the number 2. Pretty much every team has some sort of committee. Not everyone is Christian McCaffrey or like Kyren Williams like we saw last year. And we're going to talk about Kyren Williams this year pretty soon here, actually, in a couple teams, because Kyren Williams isn't going to see crazy usage rates again this year. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Every team has some sort of committee for the most part, and I expect Benson to be the B option this year. But James Conner always misses time, which means that Trey Benson could actually be a valuable handcuff to stash, even if you're not the James Conner manager. You could stash him because there will likely be a time where Conner misses games and Trey Benson is the starter. And what I like about this situation is, in the event of a James Conner injury, and I don't hope for injury to anyone, but it just seems likely that he will probably get injured. James Conner is going to be 29 years old on May 5th, and I'm recording this April 30th. So he's basically 29 years old. and his whole career, he's just struggled to stay on the field and play, an entire season. So that's not his thing. So what I like about this situation for Trey is if James Conner does go down, this is a chance where Trey Benson could be the clear lead running back for the Cardinals. A lot of times, people hold on to handcuff running backs waiting for that injury to the starter. The injury happens, but then the guy that they were handcuffing, that they were holding on to, isn't even a clear starter. He's sharing work with someone. I can't project the depth chart and how that would happen as of this recording, but just if Trey Benson is as talented as he's made out to be, he could definitely step in and be very fantasy relevant. Kind of like, Zamir White, when Josh Jacobs went down, Zamir White was everything and he was super fantasy relevant, like we saw with the Raiders last year. And Trey Benson might be more talented than Zamir White. So he could be someone to monitor in redraft even, but where this is really valuable is in Dynasty. James Conner is 29 and his contract is up after this 2024 season, and Conner will become a free agent. So if Trey Benson's play translates to the NFL, he should be the Cardinals running back 1 within the next couple seasons, as soon as the 2025 season, with potential for relevance as a second back this year and a valuable handcuff. So I really, really like him for Dynasty. Someone that I'm very intrigued by. Not too many more relevant picks for the Cardinals. They drafted a tight end in the 3rd round, Tip Reiman. But this is the Trey McBride show at tight end, and I expect Tip to be more of a blocker. I do like that name though, Tip. It's pretty hard. Pause. They also drafted wide receiver Tajon Palmer. He was selected in the 6th round. A late pick. You just never know what's going to happen with those guys. Any late pick can, exceed expectations and make a roster. But just talking about the situation, there's not a ton of proven talent behind Marvin Harrison in the wide receiver room in Arizona. They have Michael Wilson and Greg Dortch as the 2 and 3, and they've proven to be pretty good players. And Michael Wilson, coming off his rookie year, will likely improve. So I expect it to be the Wilson and Dortch as the 2 and 3, but you never know. Sometimes people come out of nowhere, so never know about Palmer. Moving on to the Seahawks, really not a lot to say. They didn't really do anything too ground moving for fantasy football purposes. I'm just going to pull up their depth chart here. Things are pretty much going to be the status quo like they were last year. They drafted AJ Barner, a tight end. What round was he drafted in? He was drafted in the 4th round out of Michigan. But I do think Noah Fant will be the starting tight end. Maybe someone down the road we worry about, but probably not. So Geno Smith, he still has his receiving core of DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and JSN. And then Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet out of the backfield, and then Noah Fant at tight end. So things should kind of be similar to last season. We'll move on to the LA Rams, and this is actually a very, very intriguing team to talk about here. So before we get into that, just one more reminder, make sure you are subscribed. We are covering the NFC teams today in this episode, so make sure that you are subscribed or following wherever you're listening so that you can tune into the next episode where we will be covering the AFC teams. We're just doing the NFC teams today. But speaking of NFC teams, this is a juicy pick here. Blake Corum, running back out of Michigan, selected by the LA Rams. Where do we start with this? So obviously last season, Kyren Williams was the man. He was amazing for fantasy. And I do think Kyren Williams will be the lead back once again. But the fact that the Rams invested a 3rd round pick on a running back means that Corum might be more of a headache than Kyren Williams managers want. Draft capital is a huge factor when it comes to running backs and the opportunity that they're given on the field. And third round draft capital is pretty high, especially in a class where there wasn't a running back taken in the first round. A lot of people were very high on Blake Corum, won a national championship with Michigan, and he was a touchdown machine. The Rams also just don't have a lot of depth behind Kyren Williams, and Kyren has missed 12 games over the last 2 seasons. So the question is, was this pick made to make this more of a committee where Kyren is 1A and Blake Corum is 1B, or an A and B situation, a 1 and 2 situation? Or was Blake Corum drafted to be a pure backup, spelling Kyren on occasion, but it's still going to be the Kyren Williams show? We just don't know. We really just don't know what is going to happen. But last season, we saw Kyren Williams on the field. He was their whole offense. He was seeing Christian McCaffrey level snap and usage rates. And I don't think we see that level again. I think Kyren will still be great for fantasy and still be the clear starter, but I just think they had to do that because they didn't have anyone else. And like when he went down, they had to sign who's that guy's name that they signed? Darrell Henderson. They signed him off the street for a few games, and then when Kyren came back, they literally cut Darrell. I mean, it was just ugly behind Kyren. So I think we'll see what level it is of a committee versus Corum being the clear backup. But I think Corum sees the field to some extent where we don't see the crazy snap rates that we saw out of Kyren in 2023. Corum was also a touchdown machine in college. So if he is used on the goal line, that's even more bad news for Kyren Williams. And yeah, because Blake Corum he's a touchdown guy. At least in college he was. And I know they had a dominant team and it's easy to score in that situation, but it could get dicey. How much of this is a 1-2 punch and how much of it is more of like an insurance back selection? But we'll have to see. Kyren Williams himself, keep this in mind, he did not have high draft capital and he still came out of nowhere. No one expected him to really do what he did in 2023. He wasn't even projected to be the starter. And then he comes in and, Cam Akers is gone. He comes in, wins people championships. Everyone expects Kyren Williams to be the clear guy, and he probably will be, but this just adds a level of murkiness just because of the third round draft capital. It could be nothing. There have been situations where running backs have been drafted in the third round. We get worried and nothing happens. I think Tank Bigsby was a third round pick, if I'm not mistaken, and that did not affect anything for Jacksonville. ETN was still the clear starter there. So I don't want to overreact. As Kyren proved, he is clearly talented, but it just adds a layer of risk. The Rams also drafted a kicker, Joshua Cardi B, out of Stanford in the 6th round, could be their starter. And they also drafted wide receiver Jordan Whittington out of Texas. Again, you never know when these late round pick guys are going to turn into something, but just talking strictly about the situation, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, Demarcus Robinson. Those are and Tutu Atwell after that. That projects to be the core wide receiver group. So, yeah, it makes things a little murky. We'll see how it plays out. But if Corum isn't super involved, it could be a situation where Kyren Williams is more attainable in drafts and in dynasty trades than he once was. But there's a reason for that. It's just a little bit sketchier now. Especially because, like I said, draft capital is a big thing with running backs. And Kyren Williams was a 5th round pick in 2022. So he doesn't have the capital where a lot of times teams are just not as committed to guys they didn't draft high for whatever reason. So I think he showed enough where I don't think this is like a James Robinson, Phillip Lindsay situation. I think Kyren is better than them, but yeah, it could get scary. But moving on to the last NFC West team, we have the San Francisco 49ers in the first round selecting wide receiver Ricky Pearsall out of Florida. This is a very intriguing pick just because it makes me wonder, does this signal a Deebo Samuel or Brandon Ayuk trade as potentially rumored? Because if it doesn't, this trade or this draft selection of Ricky Pearsall in the first round, high draft capital, it helps the team and Brock Purdy more than it helps Ricky or Deebo or Ayuk. If one of those guys gets shipped off, it becomes a little bit more clear where whoever stays will probably be the one and Pearsall will be the two. Or, if Deebo gets traded, I mean, Deebo plays such a weird role. It's hard to like replicate what he does for this team, but you know what I'm saying? The depending on who's traded, it could be a 2 wide receiver situation versus having 3 guys that need to be relevant. But if no one is traded and it's just these 3 and George Kittle at tight end, who already struggles with consistency, it could muddy the target distribution waters quite a bit, kind of like Rome Odunze to the Bears, especially in the short term. Pearsall is a athletic and exciting prospect, and if the depth chart ever does get straightened out, he could be an exciting fantasy producer. But right now, he will likely be behind Deebo, Ayuk, and George Kittle, and this offense runs primarily through CMC, Christian McCaffrey, out of the backfield. They don't throw the ball a ton. The offense is very good. They scored a lot last year, and I think they will again. But right now, the path just isn't there currently. But things change quickly. So he's talented enough where if he gets that opportunity, and it likely will come at some point down the road on this offense, he might be someone where you draft him now in Dynasty, and it doesn't have immediate returns. But if you're patient, it might pay off. Or if, like I said, if Ayuk or Deebo gets traded, as of this recording, no one has been traded, but it could happen any minute. Then all of a sudden, Ricky Pearsall's stock goes way up. So if you're drafting before the trade, you might get a value on Pearsall, because once that trade happens, everyone's going to be like, oh, geez, he's the wide receiver 2 for one of the best offenses in the league. So it's crazy how fast things can change. The team also did take running back Isaac Guerendo. That's how you pronounce that. This is Christian McCaffrey's backfield, but Elijah Mitchell's contract is up after 2024. He has good size and speed. Nice little combo there you like to see. And he could compete for the number 2 spot over Elijah Mitchell. And even if Mitchell is the number 2 this year, if they let him walk after his contract is up, Guerendo could be the number 2 back as soon as 2025. And even this year, if he beats out Mitchell, who has struggled to stay healthy. Jordan Mason is also a running back on the roster that has shown some ability. Finally, the 49ers did draft wide receiver Jake Coing in the 4th round out of Arizona. Just I mean, 4th round draft capital isn't nothing. Like, it seems like they're bolstering this wide receiver room. Right now, it's a tough depth chart to crack. But Coing is a speedster. He ran a sub 4.40. He's smaller, 5'8", 168. But it just seems like if there is a trade that goes down with Ayuk or Deebo, he could be someone who adds some depth. But I mean, even with that being said, they still have Juwan Jennings, who served as their wide receiver 3, and George Kittle at tight end. So it's a tough depth chart situation for anyone to crack at this point. Especially, it'll be easier for a 1st round pick like Pearsall than a 4th round pick like Coing out of Arizona. Moving on to the NFC East, got the Commanders taking Jayden Daniels with the 2nd overall pick out of LSU. They bring in a dual threat quarterback who will be the hopeful face of the franchise for the long haul. He's the only quarterback in FBS history with at least 12,000 passing yards and 3,000 rushing yards. So, like I said, a very dynamic player. His rushing ability will put him on fantasy radars from day one. because fantasy football scoring is broken for rushing quarterbacks. A lot of people compare him to Lamar Jackson as a player comp, so that just tells you all you need to know about his rushing upside. Caleb Williams might be the better real life prospect and have the better situation, but when it comes to fantasy, rushing is king, and it would not surprise me if Jayden Daniels has a higher ceiling and is more productive for fantasy just because of his rushing. He can run, but he is also a good, accurate passer. A lot of times rushing quarterbacks, their passing can get overlooked. He is a skilled passer, and he has good weapons. He has Terry McLaurin, he has Jahan Dotson, and they did draft another receiver who we'll talk about next. But hopefully he can help Terry McLaurin get past that Carolina DJ Moore phase of his career where we all knew DJ Moore was so good at football, but his quarterback play just limited him so much. And then he goes to a different situation, even with a guy like Justin Fields, who's not an elite quarterback himself, and just enough, he can get DJ Moore the ball, and DJ Moore had a career season, and we saw that potential pan out. While it wasn't as consistent as we hoped, it just showed that, okay, this guy does have talent. We're not crazy. So hopefully McLaurin can unlock more of his potential with an actual good quarterback if Daniels pans out. And Jahan Dotson, fellow Commanders wide receiver, he flashed as a rookie and heavily disappointed as a sophomore. So I'm hoping that Daniels can get Dotson's fantasy goodness back on track as well. It'll be interesting to see the passing volume and his ability to supply multiple targets with production, especially when you combine that with his rushing ability. And when the play breaks down, his ability to just take off versus extend the play and get it to one of those wide receivers. Speaking of wide receivers, the team also did draft wide receiver Luke McCaffrey, Christian McCaffrey's brother, who we just talked about, out of Rice. He is a converted quarterback. He'll compete with Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson for targets. But from what I hear, he should profile as more of a slot receiver. So someone who could be on the field if there's a, in like a 3 wide receiver set, play in the slot, might have some PPR value down the road, and he could be their wide receiver 3 this season. The team also took tight end Ben Sinnott out of Kansas State. Intriguing prospect, 6'4", 250 pounds, taken earlier than expected by many, but he had a good combine, he had quality college production, and now he has good draft capital. So he should get the chance to play. Rookie tight ends rarely perform for fantasy. And while Logan Thomas is no longer on the team because he retired, their former tight end, they did bring in Zach Ertz at tight end, who, he's not in his prime, but he is a serviceable veteran who will see the field and see some short area targets. But long term, if Sinnott can develop into a good NFL player, the play of Jayden Daniels, their new quarterback, will have a large impact on his upside. If the offense gets clicking and Sinnott becomes the starter, this could be someone to monitor probably, in 2 to 3 years for dynasty purposes. Redraft, probably not going to be a thing unless he bucks the trend and surpasses, of rookie tight ends not producing, and he passes Zach Ertz on the depth chart. New York Giants selected wide receiver Malik Nabers in the first round with the 6th overall pick. I think this is a great pick for everybody involved. The Giants get a much, much, much needed wide receiver option. I feel like they haven't had a good wide receiver in so long, outside of, Darius Slayton doing what he does, always being underrated, but he's not he's not an alpha wide receiver 1. He's more of a role player. And they just haven't had that top option. They brought in Kenny Golladay, just one of the worst signings in history, complete bust. So hopefully this is their wide receiver 1 that they have needed since losing Odell Beckham Jr. A big winner in this situation is also Daniel Jones, not just because he gets a good wide receiver threat to hopefully be his top option, but he gets to keep his job. The team did not select a quarterback, so Daniel Jones will be the starter in 2024. If Marvin Harrison Jr. wasn't in this class, Malik Nabers would be the top wide receiver prospect most years. He's also an LSU wide receiver, which I don't want to, rely too heavily on that, but we've seen good receivers come out of LSU. So they produce, it's kind of like Iowa with tight ends that, sometimes it's not always going to work out just because of that, but clearly they're doing something there to develop these players where it makes them a little bit more ready for the pros. Is it a coincidence or not? I don't know, but it seems to be working pretty well for LSU and wide receivers. It's just a matter of seeing his talent translate to the NFL field. But Daniel Jones is a good, competent quarterback, and he's good enough to get the ball to him if he's open. Daniel Jones is not MVP caliber, and no one would have been surprised if they drafted a quarterback here to replace him. But he is a competent, starter-worthy quarterback, in my opinion. And he'll see all the opportunity in the world, Nabers will, to be the guy. It's not a dream landing spot, like if he somehow ended up on the Bills or, some crazy offense like that. But I actually don't mind this spot, and I kind of like it just because he should be super hyper targeted, and the quarterback situation isn't that bad. So moving on, Malik Nabers will be, I like it. I think things will work out for him this year and in Dynasty, redraft and Dynasty. Also drafted Theo Johnson. Darren Waller is mulling retirement. So, they drafted a tight end, Theo Johnson, out of Penn State. He might see the field sooner than later. If Waller retires, he had a good combine. He has some traits that could translate to NFL production. Little sleeper, Daniel Bellinger is also still on the roster. He was kind of flashing early in his career, and then they brought in Darren Waller, and that was all put to bed. But would not surprise me to see Bellinger be the starter, kind of like a post-hype sleeper. And what's important to note about Bellinger is I have him on my Dynasty team, on my taxi squad, and I have to either activate him or cut him. So if I cut Bellinger, I'll let you guys know, and that means he'll be a league-winning tight end. He'll turn into like George Kittle. So when George Kittle kind of broke out of nowhere. Although I did also trade for George Kittle in that same Dynasty league before the breakout. So I'm not super bad at Dynasty. I do make good decisions too. But I expect Bellinger to be the starter. So, but not someone that can't be beat out if Theo Johnson is just a better player. So we'll see what happens. They also brought in running back Tyrone Tracy Jr., a former wide receiver. Might be using a pass catching role. Drafted out of Purdue in the 5th round. He's 5'11", 209 pounds. Devin Singletary was brought in free agency to be the starter. Tracy, though, could compete for snaps behind him as the second back. Right now on the roster, it's Singletary, Tracy, and then other than that, it's Eric Gray and Gary Brightwell. So would not be surprised to see Tracy be the number 2 running back and maybe even carve out a pass catching role. Moving on, the Philadelphia Eagles. Not a ton to talk about here, honestly. They did draft 2 cornerbacks to start the draft, 1st and 2nd round, including a appears to be Caucasian cornerback out of Iowa, Cooper DeJean, after drafting Quinwan Mitchell. Not often you see a white cornerback, so usually they end up playing safety, but that's hey, we'll see what happens, man. In terms of skill position players, they drafted running back Will Shipley out of Clemson in the 4th round. Saquon Barkley is the clear starter, obviously, and Kenneth Gainwell is also on the roster, who I would expect to be the second back. So Shipley will likely be the 3rd back behind them. But if an injury happens to one of them, Shipley might be relevant. And who knows, maybe he'll beat out Gainwell for the number 2 spot. You just never know. It's early in the process. They also drafted a wide receiver. I'm going to be careful saying this name. Ainias Smith. Ainias Smith. You got to be very careful when saying that name. You might find yourself in a hole. And they also drafted another wide receiver in the 6th round. So Smith in the 5th, Johnny Wilson in the 6th. A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith just got big contracts. Devontae Parker was also brought in, will likely operate as their number 3. You never know when a late round pick will surprise, but Smith and Wilson, Smith out of Texas A&M, 5'10", 200 pounds. Wilson out of Florida State, 6'6", 231 pounds. So very different, in build. You never know if one of these guys will exceed their draft capital, but it's going to be steep competition to play meaningful snaps anytime soon. At best, you might be able to pass Devontae Smith as a number 3. Moving on to the Dallas Cowboys, one of the teams I was looking forward to talking about the most. They did not draft a running back. It's bizarre. It's weird. I don't know what they're doing. I get you don't want to invest a ton of money into the running back position, but the draft is a great way to do that. You draft a running back, play out his rookie contract, and then you let him walk. If you really don't want to invest a ton of financial capital into the position. But no running backs drafted by the Cowboys. They did sign Ezekiel Elliott. Right now, the starter is either going to be Zeke or Rico Dowdle. It'll probably be a committee. Rico is probably the better player at this given point, but Zeke is a Cowboys legend, future Hall of Famer, likely, and he'll be involved. So I'm not sure who will be the one, but it could get messy. And like I said, I did drop Rico Dowdle in Dynasty last year, not expecting this to happen. So he will likely be a running back 1. Probably have 20 touchdowns. Big winners here: Dak Prescott, CeeDee Lamb, and also Brandon Cooks. They didn't really bring in a wide receiver to compete with Cooks for the number 2. They did draft Ryan Flournoy out of Southeast Missouri State in the 6th round. On the wide receiver depth chart, CeeDee Lamb, Brandon Cooks, Jalen Tolbert, Cavante Turbin, Jalen Brooks, Ryan Flournoy, Martavis Bryant. It's listed here. Is he still on the team? But yeah, projects to be CeeDee Lamb and Brandon Cooks as the 1 and 2. Those guys are winners because they're going to have to pass the ball a lot. It looks like they're not going to be able to really run the ball a ton. And that's kind of what their problem was last year. And we saw Dak put up a crazy season, especially in the second half of the year when they had that cake schedule. So I just tried trading for Dak in Dynasty. It was a rebuilding team. I offered Trevor Lawrence for Dak Prescott. And I also was like, hey, can you give me... And I was going to give him Trevor Lawrence and a 4th round pick this year for Dak, Prescott, Matthew Stafford, just as quarterback depth. I also have Tua, so Stafford would be my quarterback 3 in case of injury in a Dynasty league where there's no one on the waiver wire. And then I think I said, give me Adam Thielen, especially, with them signing Deontay Johnson, drafting a 1st round wide receiver that we'll talk about in a bit. Next up, actually. And he declined it because he's like, I kind of just want to keep Dak, even with the age difference. And I get it. Dak is set up to have a really good year. Moving on to the NFC South, we have the Carolina Panthers, who I just mentioned in that little tangent I went on about a trade that my friend wouldn't accept. They draft wide receiver Xavier Legette out of South Carolina. He is 6'1", 221 pounds. And he is a... Pardon me. I'm sorry I keep coughing. I feel like I've been coughing for like months and it just doesn't go away. Maybe I'm just sick of all these fan dynasty transactions not working out in my favor. But Xavier Legette, I'm trying to find his college stats here. He is such a weird story. They did trade up 1 spot to draft Legette. And in this wide receiver room, they have Adam Thielen, Deontay Johnson, and Jonathon Mingo, who they drafted last year. So things could get ugly with target distribution in the short term. But Legette, as a 1st round wide receiver, you have to think their vision is for him to see the field. And what's interesting about Xavier Legette here, I just found his stats. His first 4 years of college at South Carolina, he never had more than 200 receiving yards. He had 9 for 80, 7 for 113, 8 for 63, 18 for 167. His touchdown totals, 1, 0, 1, 3. This is in an entire seasons, not a game, entire seasons. And then in 2023, his 5th year, in 12 games, puts up 71 receptions, for 1,255 yards and 7 tutties. So it's like, where did this come from? So it's just a weird situation. He's 23 years old, and the wide receiver room is a little crowded at this moment. We also worry about target quality. We worry about target quantity with all these wide receiver options. We also worry about target quality if Bryce Young doesn't step up his play significantly from what we saw in 2023 as a rookie. Legette will get an opportunity due to his draft capital, but there are concerns about this player. He's a fifth-year breakout, which is a very late breakout age. And typically, players who translate well to the NFL, they break out at an earlier age. He did literally nothing before his final season. What he does have going for him, though, is he is a freak athlete with insane speed. He ran a 4.39 40. And he has good size, so it's a unique size speed combo, which is nice. That's good for football, good for fantasy. But he will have to overcome a likely bad offense and the historical trend of late breakouts not typically working out in the NFL. And he might. It's funny, I'm looking at this thing on ESPN. His pro comp is Jonathon Mingo, who's also on the roster. So Deontay Johnson projects to be the target leader, but they still have Adam Thielen, who is sort of a target guy. So Legette might be more of a big play guy, I guess. And he's a freak athlete, so but it's just how many scoring opportunities are there going to be on the Panthers? You know? I don't know, man. We'll see. But they also took another very important player in Jonathan Brooks in the second round, in the middle of the second round, the 14th pick of the second round, 46th overall, I believe. He was behind Bijan Robinson and Roschon Johnson at Texas, but he had a big breakout in 2023. Arguably the best running back prospect in the class. A lot of people had him there, and he was the first running back off the board in the NFL draft. He is coming off an ACL injury, but the timeline is that he should be ready for the season, and I believe training camp, from what I heard. It just depends how he heals, I guess. But this roster already has Miles Sanders and Chuba Hubbard on the roster, and he might get brought along a little bit more slowly since they do have those veterans in the backfield already. And I would have been much more excited about this pick had he found a better landing spot. Carolina's offense was terrible last season, and like I said about Legette, and unless Bryce Young can drastically improve his play, that trend projects to continue. I do like that the team is doing things to help give him weapons and build around him, but if Bryce Young doesn't play well, this offense is going to struggle. Miles Sanders, the veteran who they brought in, is on a big contract. They can't just, usually if you get a big contract, it's hard to just let that go. And then Miles Sanders did get passed on the depth chart by Chuba Hubbard last season. The former backup to McCaffrey, should have been backup to Miles Sanders, who outplayed Miles Sanders and became the starter. Chuba Hubbard and Miles Sanders are both on this depth chart, and they complicate things. I saw something that the team wants to use all three running backs. I think it's going to be disgusting. Brooks could easily be the most talented back in that running back room and win the starting job sooner than later. He's a good pass catcher, and he can be a true 3-down back, which you love. But I just worry that this is going to be a messy committee on a bad offense in the short term for redraft. For Dynasty, you just never know what'll happen 3 years from now. Look at the Texans, how quickly things turn around for them, So you never know. This offense could be good or competent in a year or two, or they might even surprise this year. So for Dynasty, I do expect Brooks to eventually be the starter, and if the team can improve, the situation will probably be better down the road. But for redraft in the short term, it might not be great. And we just might see more Chuba Hubbard and Miles Sanders than is ideal for Brooks being a true workhorse, especially coming off the ACL injury. The short-term outlook is not overly exciting, but talent matters, and he should get the majority of the work. And like I said, things change quickly, so if the situation improves, if, a couple years from now, a few years from now, and he's a starter, he could be an exciting pick. And he'll have value. He will have value this year, don't get me wrong, but it's just the ceiling might be a little limited. The Panthers also took tight end Jatavion Sanders out of Texas in the 4th round, first pick of the 4th round. They do have Tommy Tremble and Ian Thomas on the tight end depth chart right now. Like I've been saying, most rookie tight ends are not productive out of the gate, but just looking at the opportunity here, the tight end room isn't overly exciting, and if he can develop into a good player, he could be fantasy relevant down the stretch. He's, in a few years' time. He's 6'4", 245, big guy. I read his scouting report, says he has good hands, can make good catches, so can break tackles. So not someone to maybe monitor. Decent draft capital. Not crazy, but a lot of times, the highly drafted tight ends don't work out. It's those later guys that sometimes become relevant. Moving on to the Atlanta Falcons, another NFC South team. And I should have led with this, honestly. I made you guys wait. My fault. Michael Penix Jr. taken in the 1st round, 8th overall by the Atlanta Falcons. Wow. This is a terrible pick, in my opinion. The only way this is not a terrible pick is if Michael Penix turns out to be the next Patrick Mahomes. If the scouting department looked at him and said, we cannot pass on him, he is the next Tom Brady. He is the next Mahomes. He is the next GOAT. Because even if he turns out to be a good quarterback, they just fumbled this situation so poorly. Penix has an awesome arm, and he's an intriguing new prospect that apparently a lot of teams were trying to trade up to get. But this is just not the landing spot that anyone wanted for fantasy or for real life purposes. Michael Penix worked his way to become a top 10 NFL pick, and he might not start for years. Penix tore his ACL in 2018 and 2020, and he suffered suffered separate shoulder joint injuries in 2019 and 2021. So one on each shoulder. Pardon me. I'm getting sick just thinking about this pick. He played every game though, each of the last 2 seasons. He'll be, which is good to see. He could stay healthy at some point. He'll be 24 in his rookie season, and the Falcons selected him. Now, why is this a bad pick? Well, the Atlanta Falcons also just signed former Vikings quarterback Kirk Cousins to a 4-year, $180 million contract. If Kirk Cousins plays out that contract and Penix sees the field then, Michael Penix will be 28 years old. That is old for football standards. Not old where you can't play, but to start your career? That's insane. If he sees the field earlier than that, that means that something went wrong with the Kirk Cousins signing. And he is a 35-year-old quarterback coming off an Achilles injury. So if you have doubts about him, why sign him to that contract? Why not just take Penix, who he profiles as more of a pro-ready quarterback. If the Falcons were going to do this, it would make more sense to draft a younger developmental quarterback if you're going to have him sit. But man, it's just so weird. And you can kind of compare it to the Jordan Love draft pick in 2020 when they took him 26th overall. But the difference is he was 21 years old. The Packers were in win now mode, which with the signing of Kirk Cousins, the Falcons should be in. And that's what the Packers were doing. They had Aaron Rodgers. They were winning a lot of games. They were making playoff runs, and they were trying to win a championship with their Hall of Fame quarterback. And sure, like down the road, Jordan Love appears to be the quarterback of the future, but they didn't win a Super Bowl. They could have used that pick on a player that would have helped them win. It's like, at a certain point, you have to try to win. You can't always build for the future. So even if Penix turns out to be a good quarterback, okay, why? You had a good quarterback in Kirk Cousins. Or if he's not a good quarterback, then you fumbled the contract. It's a lose-lose situation. And unless Penix turns out to be just this generational talent that you sold the current moment for and you spent the 8th overall pick on, it's just a weird pick. And I just don't see like a silver lining here. The only way it works out is if Kirk Cousins gets hurt. And it's like, is that what you're planning? You're planning on your $180 million contract getting hurt? You're going to spend the 8th overall pick on a backup? It's just weird, man. And like Jordan Love, I made the comparison. He looks to be the quarterback of their future, but what Love didn't do was help the team compete when the Packers were making playoff runs, making the NFC Championship. You know? And it's like, oh, it's so weird. And they brought Cousins in to compete. The Falcons did. And if Penix does see the field years from now, it'll come years after the Falcons attempted to compete. It's just such a weird. It's so weird. It's just very rare that a top 10 pick would be completely irrelevant for fantasy. But unless Kirk gets injured, that projects to be the case for Penix for years to come. I guess maybe a year or two down the road, the Falcons could cut Kirk Cousins and eat a ton of dead money. But from a team perspective, why would you? What is the thought there? I just don't get it. I don't know. I'm not a GM, but sometimes I wonder how these people, like, unless they're playing 5D chess and nobody else understands. I don't know a single person who approves of this move other than the people inside the Falcons war room. So weird. Falcons also took running back Jace McClellan, 6th round out of Alabama. He was their leading rusher in 2023. Only issue is Bijan Robinson is on the roster and Tyler Algier is also there. They're projects to be their backup. If McClellan can outplay Tyler Algier, maybe he becomes the 2, or if Algier leaves one day, maybe he becomes the 2, but this is Bijan Robinson's backfield. I know he was used weirdly with Arthur Smith in 2023, but I think in 2024, Bijan is going to be used appropriately and see the bulk of the workload. They also drafted a wide receiver in the 6th round, Casey Washington out of Illinois. He didn't even get invited to the combine. But he joins a depth chart that already has Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Rondale Moore, Kadero Hodge, Ray McLeod. So, I mean, if somehow he turns out to be some good player that no one expected, maybe he passes Rondale Moore and best case scenario, Darnell Mooney, but that's a long shot. A big winner here is, the big winners are Drake London, Darnell Mooney. They're going to be the top 2 receivers. And also Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts will probably be the number 2 targeted player in the offense. I'm excited to see him hopefully break out. And Darnell Mooney projects to be kind of like their deep threat, and Kirk Cousins throws a good deep ball. So Drake London escapes the draft without the team taking a threat to take meaningful targets away from him. Like, I don't know, maybe they could have taken, Rome Odunze at the 8th overall pick. Someone who would have helped the team, given them a crazy receiver core, helped their new quarterback they gave almost $200 million to get the ball to some, it's just crazy. But yeah, the hype train continues for Drake London. My door just opened. Dude, my windows are so thin when it's windy out, when there's a gust of wind, the pressure like gets through and opens and closes my door. So I don't think it's a ghost, but if it is, oh well. Talk about the Saints really quick here. Got a couple more teams left, and we'll end off this video, this podcast. If you're listening, there is a video podcast on YouTube. If you're listening somewhere else, it's audio only. But Saints took a tackle in the 1st round, Talise Fuaga out of Oregon State. They really needed a tackle, so makes sense that they drafted a tackle. Hopefully it will help Kamara, who I traded for in Dynasty. Hopefully help him get some rushing lanes, as his rushing efficiency has gone down. And hopefully it can protect Derek Carr and help him get the ball down the field to Olave. They also drafted Spencer Rattler in the 5th round. He fell quite a bit in the draft. Interesting character. Has flashed, but never really became that top-end quarterback prospect. Needs to develop, but he could end up being the quarterback two behind Derek Carr. And if he develops into a starter-level quarterback, once Derek Carr is gone, who knows? Maybe we see Rattler start games for the Saints, or if Derek Carr goes down with injury. Because on the Saints depth chart, it's Derek Carr, Spencer Rattler, Taysom Hill, and Nathan Peterman. We know Nathan Peterman's not that good. Taysom Hill can play quarterback, but he's used as more of a Swiss Army knife. So yeah, I mean, in a super flex, maybe Rattler's worth holding on to just in case of a Carr injury. Maybe put him on a taxi squad, see what happens, down the road. But he was drafted in the 5th round for a reason. And Derek Carr, even though he didn't play great last year, he is their quarterback of the foreseeable future, signed through 2026. I'm looking at Spotrac. It says he has money. Oh, through 2028. What am I looking at here? Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, he's going to be the quarterback for a while. So, unless they want to eat a lot of dead money. They also drafted wide receiver Bub Means. That's a cool name. Out of Pittsburgh. 6'1", 212 pounds. Was a big play threat in college. Vertical threat. Kind of what Olave and Raheed Shaheed do already for the Saints. So I feel like, well, the third option there on their depth chart that I'm looking at, they got Cedric Wilson Jr., A.T. Perry, Equanimous St. Brown, Bub Means, who I just talked about. So maybe he competes for that wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 spot. I think A.T. Perry is a guy who has some potential too there. So I think Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed come away as big winners. There's not a lot of talent behind them, and they should be the top 2 targets in that offense. Final team of this video, this podcast, we're going to talk about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who drafted a center in the 1st round, and then they drafted wide receiver Jaleel McMillan out of Washington in the 3rd round. He might not be super relevant in 2024 without an injury to Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, or Trey Palmer. But, as Mike Evans gets older, as Chris Godwin gets older, and he had a slow start to the year, he looked a little bit better at the end of the year. So hopefully he was coming off, I believe it was an ACL injury. So hopefully Chris Godwin is back and he can play well. But as those guys get older, Jaleel McMillan might be someone who in Dynasty makes some noise, but without an injury to those guys, he's likely not going to be relevant. But he's got good vertical ability, and he can stretch the field a little bit. So in the 4th round, they also, who did they draft here? Bucky Irving, running back Bucky Irving out of Oregon. He's a good pass catcher. It makes sense they brought in depth, but they did not invest day 1 or day 2 draft capital on a running back, which is a good sign for Rachaad White. Bucky Irving can catch passes like Rachaad White, so this might be a situation where he's like a clear backup, where if Rachaad White goes down with injury, Bucky Irving steps in and is the starter. He might get some work as the number 2 just because not every running back gets every snap. But they do also have Chase Edmonds on the depth chart as well. And then the final player we're going to talk about is Devin Culp, tight end out of Washington, selected in the 7th round. He was the only tight end to run a sub 4.5 40. Interesting prospect out of Washington. Obviously, he's a 7th round pick, so not super exciting. Probably more of a depth piece than anything, because Cade Otton should be the starting tight end there. And that is going to conclude our NFC NFL draft recap. Recapping the 2024 NFL draft, just the NFC teams. We will be doing the AFC teams in the next episode. thank you all for listening. Hopefully I will not be sick and coughing as much next episode, but I'm sure I will, as I have been sick for a while. Before we head out, I just want to express my gratitude, my appreciation for you making it this far, for listening. I wish you guys well in your drafts. Listening to podcasts like mine and any fantasy football podcast is going to serve you well, whether it's Dynasty, making rookie picks, whether it's redraft, drafting rookies, or just understanding how the draft has changed things for different players, changed the fantasy landscape. I appreciate you listening, but listening to these podcasts is going to help you. I hope to help you get a better understanding of what you can do to have the best draft you can coming up and the best season you can, whether it's Dynasty or redraft. So thank you so much for listening. If you made it this far, please consider subscribing or following wherever you're listening. If you're on YouTube, make sure to drop a like and subscribe. And that's going to conclude this episode. Aquatic Pets is going to play us out again. Thank you so much, everybody. And I will see you guys in the next episode, where we will be recapping the AFC teams and their respective 2024 NFL drafts. Good luck if you're drafting anytime soon for Dynasty. Peace and love, and I will see you all in the next one, where we will become fantasy football prodigies. Peace.
They said